The bitter wind howled through the mountains like a hungry ghost, cutting through his thin jacket as if it were paper, while the temperature plummeted far below anything he had prepared for. Mark Jenkins had been certain this would be a simple day hike, but now, lost in the sudden blizzard with night falling and his phone dead, he knew this simple mistake might be his last. If you love incredible true stories about the mysterious bond between humans and animals that remind us we're never truly alone in this world, please subscribe to our channel now so you don't miss any of these heartwarming tales of survival and connection. The snow was already knee-deep and rising fast, each step becoming a battle as Mark struggled to follow what he thought was the trail back to the ranger station. Visibility had dropped to mere feet in front of him, the white world closing in as his extremities began to numb dangerously. As an experienced hiker who had conquered trails across 3 continents, Mark had always prided himself on his careful preparation and respect for nature's power. But today, a series of small misjudgments had cascaded into a life-threatening situation. Ranger. Sarah Connolly's boots squeaked against the polished floor of Glacier National Park's visitor center as she made her final rounds before closing. Outside, the promised storm had arrived with unexpected ferocity, transforming the majestic Montana landscape into a treacherous white void. She paused at the window, watching ice crystals dance in the beam of the security light, her experienced eye noting how quickly the accumulation was building. "Looks worse than the forecast predicted," she muttered to herself, pulling her parka service jacket tighter around her shoulders despite the building's adequate heating. As she turned to leave, Sarah's gaze caught on something in the nearly empty parking lot. A lone blue Subaru Outback dusted with several inches of fresh snow. Her brow furrowed. All scheduled tours had returned hours ago, and her staff had checked in before departing. Whoever owned that vehicle was still out in the park with darkness fallen and conditions deteriorating rapidly. Sarah pulled out her flashlight and trudged through the thickening snow to inspect the car. Peering through the windows, she spotted a photography magazine, an empty coffee cup, and a trail map opened to the Falcon Ridge area, a popular spot for capturing dramatic vistas but treacherous in poor weather. The vehicle registration showed the owner as Mark Jenkins from Missoula. Back inside, Sarah pulled up the day's visitor log. Mark Jenkins, 35, had signed in alone at 10:23 a.m., noting his intended return by 3 p.m. It was now past the damn it, she whispered, reaching for the phone. Park protocol was clear for situations like this, but with the storm intensifying beyond predictions, immediate search operations would be nearly impossible and potentially fatal for rescuers. While waiting for her supervisor to answer, Sarah's attention drifted to a bulletin board where she'd posted a missing pet flyer earlier that week. The Henderson family, John, Melissa, and their 10-year-old daughter Emma, had been camping when their Alaskan Malamute, Luna, had disappeared during a short hike. The family had searched for 2 days before the approaching storm forced them to leave without their beloved pet. Sarah remembered Emma's tear-streaked face as they departed, the girl clutching her dog's favorite blue toy. "Luna's smart. She'll find shelter," Sarah had assured her, though privately she'd harbored doubts about any domestic animal surviving the coming storm. "Sarah, what's the situation?" Her supervisor's voice crackled through the phone, pulling her back to the present crisis. "We've got a hiker unaccounted for, vehicle still in the lot, signed out for Falcon Ridge, return time over 3 hours ago." Heavy sigh came through the line. Conditions? Deteriorating fast. Visibility under 50 feet and dropping. Temperature already at 15 degrees with wind chill, pushing it below zero. Any indication of experience level? Sarah glanced at the sign-in sheet. Notes say experienced hiker, solo photography trip. I'll alert county search and rescue, but you know as well as I do that nobody's getting up there tonight, her supervisor said grimly. Best we can do is prep for first light, assuming there's a break in the storm. Understood, Sarah replied, already mentally cataloging the equipment they'd need. I'll start organizing from this end." After ending the call, Sarah began methodical preparations for the morning operation, trying not to dwell on what Mark Jenkins might be enduring on the mountain. Hypothermia would set in quickly without proper gear. If he'd become disoriented or injured, her phone rang again, the Hendersons calling for their nightly update about Luna. "Any news?" Melissa Henderson asked, hope and resignation battling in her voice. "I'm sorry, nothing yet," Sarah replied gently. "And with this storm—" "We understand," Melissa said. "It's just hard explaining to Emma that we might never know what happened to Luna." "Malamutes are hardy dogs," Sarah offered, the same reassurance she'd given days earlier now sounding hollow, even to her own ears. "Designed for exactly these conditions. That's what John keeps saying, but she's still our pet, not a wild animal." Melissa paused. "Emma wanted me to ask if you'd checked the lost and found box for Luna's collar. It has a special tag Emma made, a blue paw print." "No collar's been turned in, but I'll double-check tomorrow," Sarah promised, making a note. After ending the call, Sarah returned to preparing the search gear, thermal imaging equipment, emergency medical supplies, satellite phones, and survival kits. County Search and Rescue would bring avalanche dogs, but they'd need to wait for helicopter support until the weather cleared. Her thoughts turned back to Mark Jenkins, alone somewhere on the mountain. The temperature would continue dropping throughout the night. Without shelter and proper equipment, his chances of survival diminished with each passing hour. Sarah had seen too many rescues turn into recoveries over her 15 years with the Park Service. Each loss felt personal, like a failure of her stewardship of these mountains she considered home. Her own father had been a ranger here, teaching her to respect the dual nature of wilderness, its breathtaking beauty and unforgiving brutality. When he died in an avalanche during a rescue operation 12 years ago, Sarah had nearly left the service. Instead, she'd committed herself to becoming the most skilled search and rescue coordinator in the region. As she methodically checked emergency transponders, Sarah tried to picture Mark Jenkins. The experienced hikers were sometimes the most dangerous rescues, their confidence occasionally crossing into overconfidence. Had he ignored the weather warnings, thinking his experience would see him through? Or had he simply been caught unprepared when the storm accelerated beyond forecasts? Outside, the wind slammed against the visitor center windows, snow now falling at nearly 2 inches per hour. Sarah zipped equipment bags and set them by the door for morning. There was nothing more she could do tonight except hope that Mark Jenkins had found adequate shelter and possessed the survival knowledge to make it through until first light. "Hang in there," she whispered toward the dark mountains beyond the glass. "We're coming as soon as we can." Upstairs in her small apartment, attached to the ranger station, Sarah set her alarm for 4:30 a.m., though she doubted she'd sleep much. Experience had taught her that the first hours after daybreak were critical in winter rescues. Lives often hung in the balance of minutes, not hours. As she finally drifted toward uneasy sleep, her last thoughts were of 2 souls lost on the mountain, a man she'd never met, and a dog whose owner waited for news she increasingly feared would never come. The fall had happened so quickly. One moment Mark was struggling forward through knee-deep snow. The next, he was tumbling down a steep embankment, pain exploding through his left ankle as his backpack tore away from his shoulders. He came to rest at the bottom of a small ravine, the wind momentarily blocked by the ridge above him, his breath forming frantic clouds in the frigid air. "Help!" he shouted, though he knew it was futile. His voice disappeared into the howling storm, swallowed by the vastness of the wilderness around him. No one would hear. No one was coming. Not tonight. Mark pulled himself into a sitting position, wincing as he assessed the damage. His ankle wasn't broken, he could still move it, but the rapid swelling and intense pain suggested a severe sprain. Worse, his main backpack with most of his supplies was nowhere in sight, likely buried in the snow somewhere above. All he had was the small camera bag still strapped across his chest, his now soaked jacket, and whatever was in his pockets. He patted himself down, taking inventory: a half-eaten energy bar, a pocket knife, matches in a waterproof case, and a small first aid kit. It wasn't enough. Not in these conditions. "Think, Mark," he muttered to himself, fighting back the panic rising in his chest. Shelter first. Survival training from his years of wilderness photography kicked in. Without a tent or tarp, he needed natural protection. Looking around, he spotted a cluster of dense pines nearby, their branches sagging under the weight of accumulated snow. It wasn't ideal, but the space beneath those lower branches would block the worst of the wind and snow. Moving was agony. Each shuffle through the deep snow sent bolts of pain shooting up from his ankle. By the time he reached the pines, Marky was sweating despite the bitter cold, a dangerous sign he recognized as the beginning of hypothermia. Using his pocket knife, he cut several lower branches and created a crude entrance to the space beneath the tree. Inside, the ground was relatively clear of snow, with a thick carpet of fallen needles. The close-set branches formed a natural ceiling, blocking the direct snowfall. "Fire," he said aloud, needing to hear a human voice, even his own. "Need a fire." Despite the protection of the tree, the temperature was dropping rapidly as night deepened. Mark knew his survival depended on generating heat. He gathered what dry materials he could find from the interior of his shelter: dead pine needles, small twigs, the paper wrapper from his energy bar. With trembling hands, he arranged a small fire pit, clearing away needles to create a safe burning area. The matches were his most precious resource. He struck one carefully, shielding the flame with his body as he touched it to his tinder pile. The materials caught, but the flame remained small and temperamental. He fed it carefully, adding slightly larger twigs as it grew, silently thanking his photography mentor, who had insisted he learn proper survival skills before their expedition to Patagonia years ago. As the modest fire established itself, Mark turned his attention to his injured ankle. Removing his boot was excruciating, but necessary to prevent further swelling from constricting circulation. The ankle had already ballooned, mottled purple bruising spreading across his skin. From his small first aid kit, he extracted an elastic bandage and carefully wrapped the injury, providing support without cutting off blood flow. The fire's warm glow illuminated his shelter, casting long shadows against the snow outside. Mark huddled closer to the flames, extending his hands toward the heat. He was still dangerously cold, his clothes damp from exertion and snow. Hypothermia remained his greatest immediate threat. Should have listened to the weather report. He berated himself, thinking of the ranger at the visitor center who had warned him about the approaching storm. But he had been so certain he could get to Falcon Ridge and back before the worst hit. The perfect winter shot would have been worth its dramatic clouds building over snow-covered peaks, perhaps with wildlife in the foreground. Instead, he'd gotten turned around as visibility dropped, taking what he thought was a shortcut back to the trailhead. That mistake had led him here, to this desperate situation. Mark's thoughts drifted to the life he'd been trying to escape through this solitary expedition. The divorce papers finalized just 3 weeks ago after Samantha had finally tired of his extended absences for photography assignments. The prestigious Wildlife magazine that had rejected his portfolio, citing lack of emotional depth in his technically perfect images. The empty apartment in Missoula that didn't yet feel like home. Had he been careless today because some part of him didn't care what happened? The thought was disturbing enough to snap him back to the present. Whatever problems awaited him back in civilization, he wasn't ready to die. The small fire began to sputter as it consumed the limited fuel. Mark carefully added his last few twigs, knowing it wouldn't last much longer. Without more substantial wood, he couldn't maintain the flame through the night. He needed to conserve his remaining matches for morning when he might have a chance to find better materials. As the fire dimmed, the cold pressed in again. Mark tucked his hands inside his jacket and pulled his knees to his chest, trying to conserve body heat. He needed to stay awake, to keep moving enough to generate warmth without exhausting himself. The balance was precarious. To keep his mind active, he recited photography settings like a mantra. F8 at 1x125, ISO 100, F11 at 160, ISO 100. The familiar numbers were comforting, a connection to normal life that seemed increasingly distant as the night deepened around him. The wind changed direction, driving snow through gaps in his shelter. Mark shifted position, turning his back to the intrusion. As he moved, something caught his attention, a sound different from the constant howl of the storm. He held his breath, listening intently. There it was again, a rustling outside his shelter, too deliberate to be merely wind. Something was moving out there in the darkness. His initial surge of hope, rescuers already, quickly faded. No search party would be out in these conditions, which meant it was an animal. Wolves roamed these mountains, as did mountain lions and bears, though most would be denning during a storm like this. Whatever was circling his shelter was likely. Drawn by his scent or the lingering smoke from his now dying fire, Mark reached for his pocket knife, a pitifully inadequate defense, but all he had. The rustling came closer to the entrance of his shelter. He stared into the darkness beyond the faint glow of the embers, heart pounding painfully in his chest. "Go away," he called, trying to sound authoritative despite his fear. Nothing for, "You here." The movement outside paused. Then, incredibly, a snow-covered snout pushed through the branches at the entrance of his shelter, followed by the distinct pointed ears and thick fur of what was unmistakably a large dog. Mark's grip tightened on his pocket knife as he stared at the animal, now half inside his shelter. The dog, definitely a dog, not a wolf, was massive, with thick gray and white fur now crusted with snow and ice. Its pale blue eyes regarded Mark with what seemed like careful assessment rather than aggression. "Hey there," Mark said cautiously, lowering the knife. He'd grown up with dogs and recognized the difference between a threatening posture and a curious one. This animal, despite its wolf-like appearance, showed no signs of aggression. "Where did you come from?" The dog remained at the entrance, still evaluating. Now that his initial fear had subsided, Mark could see it was an Alaskan Malamute, a breed designed for precisely these harsh conditions. Its coat was matted in places, suggesting it had been out in the wilderness for some time. A lost pet, perhaps, or abandoned by hikers who underestimated its needs. "I don't have any food to share," Mark said apologetically, speaking in the soft, even tone he'd use with any unfamiliar dog. To his surprise, the Malamute backed out of the shelter entrance, disappearing into the darkness. Mark felt an irrational pang of disappointment. Even a wild dog would have been company through the long, dangerous night ahead. But minutes later, the rustling returned. The dog reappeared at the entrance, this time dragging something in its mouth. A substantial branch, dead and relatively dry under its covering of snow. Mark stared in disbelief as the animal dropped the branch just inside the shelter entrance, then looked at him expectantly, as if waiting for him to understand. "Firewood?" Mark whispered, reaching for the branch. "You brought me firewood?" The Malamute made a soft whining sound that might have been confirmation. Mark brushed snow from the branch, finding that it was indeed dry enough to burn. Breaking it into manageable pieces, he carefully rebuilt his fire pit, then used one of his precious matches to ignite the remaining tinder. The new wood caught, and soon a much stronger fire was burning, pushing back the deadly cold that had been seeping into Mark's bones. "Thank you," he said sincerely, looking up at the dog still watching from the entrance. That was exactly what I needed." As if taking the words as an invitation, the Malamute fully entered the shelter, shaking off snow in a motion that sent crystalline droplets sparkling in the firelight. The dog circled the small space once before settling just beyond arm's reach, its body positioned between Mark and the entrance. They regarded each other across the fire, human and canine, both outsiders in the merciless winter wilderness. Mark wondered if the dog's apparent helping behavior was simply coincidence. Perhaps it had been playing with the stick and happened to bring it to his shelter. Yet he couldn't shake the feeling that the animal understood his predicament. "Do you have a name?" Mark asked, noting no collar around the thick fur of the dog's neck. "Someone must be missing you." The Malamute's ears perked up at his voice but offered no clues to its origins. Its size and condition suggested it wasn't a long-term stray. Someone had cared for this animal, and relatively recently. As the fire strengthened, warmth gradually returned to Mark's extremities. The dog's presence changed the atmosphere in the small shelter, making it feel less like a desperate last stand against nature and more like a temporary haven. There was something profoundly comforting about not facing the night alone. "I don't suppose you know the way to the ranger station?" Mark asked with a weak smile. The Malamute tilted its head, blue eyes reflecting the dancing flames. "No, I didn't think so," Mark sighed. "We're both lost, aren't we?" Despite the improved fire, the temperature continued to drop as night deepened. Mark's injured ankle throbbed painfully, and his damp clothes still clung uncomfortably to his skin. He knew that even with the fire, the cold remained dangerous. He needed to maintain his core temperature through the night to have any chance of attempting to find help in the morning. As if sensing his discomfort, the Malamute suddenly stood, shook itself, and moved closer to Mark. Before he could react, the dog settled against his side, its large warm body pressing against him. "Oh," Mark said, startled by the gesture. "Thank you." The dog's body heat was substantial, like a living furnace against his side. Mark cautiously placed a hand on the animal's thick fur, and when it didn't object, he gently stroked its coat. Ice crystals melted beneath his touch as the fire's warmth combined with the dog's natural heat to create a pocket of surprising comfort in their tiny shelter. "Where did you learn to be a rescue dog?" Mark murmured. "Because you're doing a pretty good job." The Malamute made a soft, rumbling sound, almost like a purr, and settled its massive head on its paws, eyes remaining alert and fixed on the shelter entrance. As the hours passed, Mark alternated between adding wood to the fire and drifting into brief periods of fitful sleep, always with the reassuring presence of the dog against him. Whenever the fire began to dim, he would awaken to find the Malamute watching him expectantly, as if reminding him of the importance of maintaining the flame. During one such moment of wakefulness, Mark noticed the storm's voice had changed. The howling wind had softened to an occasional moan, and the constant patter of snow against the pine boughs had lessened. Peering past the dog toward the shelter entrance, he could make out stars through gaps in the branches. The storm was breaking. Up, at least temporarily. "Might have a chance tomorrow after all," he told the dog, who responded by pressing more firmly against his side. The shared warmth and unexpected companionship had significantly improved Mark's odds of survival. Without the dog, he realized, he might well have succumbed to hypothermia during the night. Instead, he had maintained enough body heat to prevent the worst effects, and the larger fire had kept the shelter temperature survivable. As dawn approached, pale light gradually filtered through the snow-laden branches. Mark's ankles still throbbed, painfully, but the rest of his body felt stronger than he had dared hope. Beside him, the Malamute remained alert, occasionally rising to stretch before returning to its protective position. "I don't know how you found me," Mark said quietly, rubbing the dog behind its ears, "or why you decided to help, but I'm pretty sure you saved my life last night." The dog turned to look at him with those intelligent blue eyes, and Mark had the distinct impression it understood every word. There was something almost mystical about finding this specific animal, one perfectly adapted to survive in these conditions, precisely when he needed help most. With the new day came new challenges. Mark needed to find his way back to civilization. With an injured ankle, limited supplies, and no clear sense of direction. But somehow, with this unexpected companion at his side, the task seemed less impossible than it had the night before. "What do you say?" he asked the Malamute, as sunlight began to illuminate the white world outside their shelter. "Should we try to find our way home together?" The dog stood, stretched thoroughly, then moved to the entrance of the shelter, looking back at Mark with what seemed unmistakably like encouragement. Despite the pain and uncertainty that lay ahead, Mark felt something he hadn't expected to feel again after the terror of the previous day: hope. Sarah Connolly's alarm blared at 4:30 a.m., though she'd been awake for nearly an hour already, listening to the storm. The predicted overnight snowfall had exceeded forecasts, with accumulation reaching nearly 18 inches in some areas. Worse, the Weather Service was now warning of a second system moving in by late afternoon, a potentially deadlier storm with high winds and temperatures plummeting well below zero. She dressed quickly in her cold weather gear, thermal base layers, insulated, pants, heavy socks, and her Park Service winter jacket. Outside her window, the snow had temporarily stopped, and breaks in the cloud cover revealed a star-filled sky. It wouldn't last long, but the window might be enough to get search teams onto the mountain. As she entered the visitor center's main office, her phone rang. It was John Henderson. "Any news on the search?" he asked without preamble. Sarah hesitated. "John, it's not even 5 a.m. We're just organizing now." I know. It's just... Emma had a dream about Luna last night. She's convinced her dog is still alive up there." Sarah closed her eyes briefly. The missing hiker was her priority, but she understood the Hendersons' concern for their pet. "We'll keep an eye out for Luna while we search for the missing hiker," she promised. "But I have to be honest, after 4 days in these conditions..." "I understand," John said quietly. "It's just hard to give up hope when Emma is so certain. She keeps saying Luna would find shelter, that she's smart enough to survive." "Kids have good instincts sometimes," Sarah offered, not wanting to crush their hope entirely. "Look, I need to coordinate with the county team now, but I'll call if we find anything at all." After ending the call, Sarah switched to professional mode, reviewing topographical maps of Falcon Ridge and the surrounding areas. If Mark Jenkins had been attempting to photograph the sunset, he would likely have headed to one of several prime viewpoints. If he'd gotten lost on the return trip in deteriorating visibility, there were 3 main drainage areas he might have descended into by mistake, each leading farther from the trailhead rather than toward it. County search and rescue arrived. At 5:30 a.m., a team of 6 experienced mountaineers, led by Mike Thorson, a grizzled veteran of alpine rescues. They brought 2 avalanche dogs, German shepherds trained to locate humans buried in snow. "Conditions report?" Mike asked briskly as his team unloaded equipment. "We've got a break in the storm, but it won't last," Sarah replied. "Another system moving in by late afternoon, potentially worse than last night's. Temperatures holding around 10 degrees now, but dropping throughout the day." Mike nodded grimly. "Helicopter on standby in Kalispell, but they're reporting wind. Sheer at elevation. They'll fly if conditions permit, but don't count on air support initially." The team gathered around the maps as Sarah outlined the search areas and what they knew about Mark Jenkins. Experienced hiker and photographer, so he might have equipment beyond basic daypack supplies, likely in good physical condition. Was hiking alone and missed his checkout time by at least 3 hours before we noticed his car. "Survival chances?" one of the newer team members asked. Mike and Sarah exchanged glances. Both knew the statistics for overnight exposure in these. "Conditions. Depends on his gear and whether he found shelter," Mike answered carefully. "If he maintained core temperature through the night, we could be looking at a rescue rather than a recovery." "But the clock is ticking," Sarah added, "especially with another storm system approaching." They divided into 3 teams, each taking one of the drainage areas where Mark might have gone off trail. Sarah would lead the team searching the eastern drainage, which included several rock formations popular with photographers. As they prepared to depart, Her phone rang again. It was Melissa Henderson. "I know you're heading out," Melissa said apologetically, "but Emma insisted I call. She wants you to look for Luna near the big rocks that look like sleeping bears. That's where they were when Luna disappeared." Sarah frowned. "Sleeping Bear Rocks? That's in the eastern drainage area. Is that helpful?" Melissa asked. "It might be," Sarah replied thoughtfully. "That's one of the areas we're searching today." "Did Luna have any identification? Tags? Microchip?" "She had a collar with tags, including Emma's homemade one, a blue paw print. And yes, she's microchipped." "Understood. I'll keep it in mind." After ending the call, Sarah relayed the information to her team as they loaded gear into the snow-capable utility vehicles that would take them as far as the trailheads. From there, they would continue on specialized snowshoes designed for steep terrain. "We've got a possible location for both the missing hiker and the dog," she explained. "Jenkins may have been photographing at Sleeping Bear Rocks, and that's also where the Henderson family lost their dog 4 days ago." 4 days is a long time for a domestic animal in these conditions, commented Rick, one of the search team members. "Alaskan Malamute," Sarah replied, "bred for Arctic conditions. If any dog could survive, it would be that breed." The journey to the eastern trailhead took longer than usual due to deep snow on the park roads. Sunrise painted the mountains in shades of pink and gold as they unloaded their equipment and prepared for the ascent. The beauty stood in stark contrast to the life-or-death nature of their mission. Sarah activated her radio and GPS tracking device, then addressed the team. "Remember, we're looking for both Mark Jenkins and potentially a gray and white Alaskan Malamute named Luna. Standard protocols, 20-meter visual spacing, regular radio check-ins, and constant awareness of avalanche conditions. This break in the weather is our window. We need to make it count." As they began their ascent, Sarah found herself thinking about the coincidence of the missing dog and hiker potentially being in the same area. In her 15 years with the Park Service, she'd seen enough unusual occurrences to develop a respect for the unexpected connections that sometimes emerged. In wilderness situations, the snow was deep and powdery, making progress slow despite their specialized gear. Sarah monitored her team's exertion levels carefully. A rescue required rescuers to maintain their own safety and energy reserves. They stopped briefly every 30 minutes to hydrate and check communications. During one such break, Sarah gazed up at the mountainside ahead. Sleeping Bear Rocks was still at least an hour away at their current pace. The temporary clearing had already begun to fade, with clouds rebuilding along the western horizon. Their window was closing faster than anticipated. "We need to pick up the pace," she told her team. "Weather's shifting earlier than forecast." They resumed their ascent with renewed urgency. Sarah led the way, her mind focused on the terrain while a part of her wondered what they would find. Would Mark Jenkins have survived the night? Could an Alaskan Malamute really have lasted 4 days in these conditions? And was it mere coincidence that both had disappeared in the same area? The answers lay somewhere on the mountain ahead, beneath the fresh snow and the gathering clouds that promised more to come. Sarah adjusted her pack and pressed forward, each step taking them closer to whatever awaited at Sleeping Bear Rocks. Morning light filtered through the pine branches, casting dappled patterns on the snow as Mark emerged from his makeshift shelter. Each movement sent sharp pain through his injured ankle, but a night of relative warmth and rest had left him stronger. Then he dared hope. The Malamute waited patiently, watching as Mark tested his weight on the damaged joint. "Not great," he muttered, grimacing, "but I can move." He fashioned a crude walking stick from a sturdy branch using his pocket knife to strip away smaller offshoots. The dog observed with apparent interest, head tilted slightly as if evaluating his craftsmanship. "What do you think?" Mark asked, testing the stick against his weight. "Will it hold?" In response, the Malamute moved to his injured side, positioning itself where Mark could potentially lean against its substantial frame for additional support. The gesture seemed so deliberate that Mark found himself once again wondering about this animal's unusual behavior. "You've done this before, haven't you?" he said. "Helped someone. You're too good at this to be making it up as you go." The sky above had cleared temporarily, revealing a brilliant blue expanse that belied the danger of their situation. Mark knew from experience that mountain weather was treacherous and changeable. This break might last hours or mere minutes. Either way, it was their best chance to find help. The question was which direction to go. Without his backpack and its compass, Mark had limited means to orient himself. He knew the visitor center and ranger station lay somewhere to the west, but in the confusing swirl of yesterday's storm, he'd lost all sense of direction. "Any ideas?" he asked the dog half-jokingly. "Ranger station is west, but which way is west from here?" To his astonishment, the Malamute moved away from him, trotted about 20 feet through the snow, then stopped and looked back expectantly. When Mark didn't immediately follow, the dog returned, nudged his leg gently, then repeated the movement in the same direction. "You want me to follow you?" Mark asked incredulously. The Malamute made a soft whining sound that seemed affirmative. Mark hesitated. Following a stray dog through the wilderness seemed absurd, yet this animal had already saved his life once. And something in those intelligent blue eyes inspired trust that transcended rational explanation. "Okay," he decided. "Let's try it your way. You haven't steered me wrong yet." Their progress was painfully slow. Even with the walking stick and occasional support from the dog, Mark's injured ankle made each step an exercise in endurance. The Subuk snow, thigh-deep in places, further complicated their journey. The Malamute forged ahead, creating a path that Mark could follow, sometimes circling back to check on him when he fell too far behind. As they traveled, Mark's thoughts drifted to the circumstances that had brought him to this moment. The divorce had been finalized just 23 days ago, ending a 7-year marriage that had gradually eroded under the strain of his frequent absences and Samantha's growing resentment. "I can't compete with mountains and wildlife," she'd said during their last real conversation. "There's always another shot, another assignment that matters more than being here." She hadn't been entirely wrong. Mark had prioritized his photography, career over stability, pursuing assignments around the world while Samantha built her life in Missoula. He'd convinced himself they had an understanding that his work required these sacrifices until the day he'd returned from a month in Alaska to find half their apartment empty and divorce papers on the kitchen counter. The rejection from National Geographic had come just weeks later. "Technically impressive, but lacking emotional resonance," the photo editor had written. "Your images show us what you saw, but not what you felt." The combination had sent Mark into a spiral of self-doubt. Was he failing at both life and art? Was technical perfection without emotional connection the pattern of his entire existence? This solo trip to Glacier National Park had been an attempt to recalibrate, to find something authentic in his work and himself. Instead, he'd nearly died alone in a snowstorm. The irony wasn't lost on him that his survival now depended on connection with this mysterious dog, who had appeared like a guardian spirit in his moment of greatest need. After about an hour of difficult travel, they reached a ridge that offered a broader view of the surrounding terrain. The landscape was transformed by snow, familiar features rendered alien under their white blanket. Mark scanned the horizon, hoping for some recognizable landmark. To his surprise, he spotted a distant cluster of rock formations that resembled sleeping bears, a well-known photography location he'd visited on previous trips to the park. If he could reach those rocks, he might be able to orient himself properly. "I know where we are," he told the Malamute excitedly. "Those are the sleeping bear rocks. The main trail should be just beyond them." The dog looked in the direction he was pointing, then back at Mark, its tail wagging slightly. "Is that where you were taking me?" Mark asked, a new suspicion forming. "Do you know that area?" As if in answer, The Malamute continued in precisely that direction, its pace slightly quicker now. Mark followed as best he could, his spirits lifted by this first concrete sign that they weren't wandering aimlessly. As they approached the distinctive rock formation, Mark noticed something caught on a protruding branch, a small scrap of fabric, fluttering in the light breeze. He detoured slightly to investigate, finding a torn piece of what appeared to be a dog collar. Attached to the broken collar was a handmade tag, a blue paw print painted on a round metal disc. "Is this yours?" he asked, holding the tag toward the Malamute. The dog sniffed the item, tail wagging more vigorously now. Mark turned the tag over, finding a name engraved on the reverse side. "Luna." "Luna," he said experimentally. "Is that your name, Luna?" The Malamute's reaction was immediate and unmistakable, ears perking up, posture changing to one of alert excitement. There was no doubt this was indeed Luna, and she recognized her name. "You're someone's pet," Mark said, pocketing the tag. "Someone's looking for you." The discovery changed his understanding of their partnership. Luna wasn't a mystical wilderness guide. She was a lost family pet, somehow surviving on her own in these mountains, yet that made her assistance no less remarkable. Lost herself, she had nonetheless stopped to help a stranger in need. Their moment of connection was interrupted by a distant rumble. Mark looked up to see dark clouds building rapidly on the western horizon, the next storm system approaching, faster than he'd hoped. They needed shelter again, and soon. "We should find somewhere to wait this out," he told Luna, who had also turned toward the threatening clouds. But rather than seeking immediate shelter, Luna continued toward sleeping. Bare rocks with increased urgency, Mark followed, trusting her instinct despite his growing concern about the approaching storm. They had perhaps an hour before it hit, not enough time to reach the ranger station, even if they knew exactly where it was. As they neared the rocks, Luna suddenly stopped, her posture alert. Mark halted beside her, listening. For a moment, he heard nothing but the whisper of wind through pines. Then, faintly but distinctly, a sound that sent hope surging through him, a human voice calling in the distance. "Hello?" he shouted with all his remaining strength. "I'm here! Help!" Luna added her voice to his, her howl carrying much farther than Mark's shout. They waited, breathless, until the distant call came again, closer this time, and unmistakably human. Mark looked down at the Malamute who had saved his life, led him to safety, and now summoned help, just as the next storm threatened. "Luna," he said softly, "you are absolutely extraordinary." Luna pressed against his leg briefly, then raised her head and howled again, guiding rescuers to their location, as the first snowflakes of the new storm began to fall around them. Sarah's team had been climbing for nearly 2 hours when Rick, one of the search specialists, called out, "Ranger Connolly, over here!" Sarah made her way carefully through the deep snow to where Rick stood examining something half buried in a drift. As she approached, she recognized the shape, a backpack, high quality, and designed for day hiking rather than extended trips. "Jenkins?" she asked, already pulling on an extra pair of gloves to examine the find. Rick nodded. Name tag on the inside pocket. Sarah carefully brushed away snow and unzipped the main compartment. Inside, she found a professional camera case, empty water bottles, energy bar wrappers, a compact emergency blanket still in its packaging, and a trail map. The discovery confirmed their worst fears. Mark Jenkins was somewhere in the wilderness without his main supplies. He must have lost it somehow, she said, scanning the surrounding area. They stood at the edge of a small ravine, its steep sides now softened by heavy snow. "Probably fell down there," Mike joined them, examining the ravine with experienced eyes. "If he went down that in yesterday's conditions, he could be injured." Sarah nodded grimly, which means he wouldn't have gotten far. She keyed her radio. "All teams, this is Connolly. We've located Jenkins' backpack near the East Ravine, approximately half a mile below Sleeping Bear Rocks. He's without supplies and potentially injured. converge on our GPS coordinates. The search dogs, who had been working a grid pattern nearby, suddenly became alert, catching a scent. Their handler, Dave, gave them the command to follow, and the Sabra German shepherds began moving purposefully through the snow, noses down. "They've got something," Dave called. The team followed the dogs as they tracked along the bottom of the ravine, then up the opposite side. Sarah noted small depressions in the snow, partially filled by fresh powder, but still visible to trained eyes. "Footprints," she confirmed. "Adult male, uneven gait suggesting injury." But there was something else alongside the human tracks. Another set of prints that caused Sarah to stop and kneel for closer examination. "Canine," she said, measuring the print with her gloved fingers. "Large breed, deep chest impression when resting." She looked up at Mike with a puzzled expression. "These look like they could be from an Alaskan Malamute. The missing dog, Luna?" Mike asked skeptically. "After 4 days?" "It's possible," Sarah replied, standing to follow the tracks further. "Malamutes are Arctic dogs. They can survive temperatures well below what we've had." The dual tracks continued in a relatively straight line towards Sleeping Bear Rocks, the human prints showing an inconsistent pattern, suggesting the person was limping or using some kind of support. More concerning were the small drops of blood Sarah occasionally spotted in the snow. Jenkins was definitely injured. As they followed the trail, the weather began to shift. The temporary clearing that had allowed their search was rapidly disappearing as new clouds built from the west. Wind picked up, driving fine crystals of snow that stung exposed skin and reduced visibility. "How much time do you think we have?" Rick asked, glancing nervously at the approaching weather front. "An hour, maybe less," Sarah replied. "We need to move faster." They increased their pace, following the tracks that were already beginning to fill with fresh snow. The search dogs remained focused despite the deteriorating conditions, a testament to their training and determination. When they reached the base of Sleeping Bear Rocks, the tracks became less distinct as the terrain changed from deep snow to wind-scoured stone and patchy drifts. The search dogs circled, temporarily losing the scent before regaining it on the far side of the formation. "They went around to the lee side," Dave observed. "Smart move, better protection from the wind." Sarah nodded. Anyone with wilderness experience would seek the most sheltered position in anticipation of a storm. If Jenkins was injured but still thinking clearly, that's exactly where he would go. As they rounded the massive rock formation, Sarah suddenly held up her hand, signaling the team to stop. "Listen," she said. For a moment, there was only the sound of wind through the pines and their own breathing. Then, faintly but unmistakably, a human voice calling for help, followed by the distinctive howl of a dog. "That's not one of our dogs," Dave said, restraining the German shepherds who had begun pulling toward the sound. "Jenkins!" Sarah shouted. "Mark Jenkins!" They waited, the seconds stretching painfully, before the answering call came again. Stronger, this time, and definitely human. The dog howled once more, the sound eerily beautiful against the backdrop of the mountains. "This way," Sarah directed, leading the team toward the voice. The wind was picking up further, driving the first flakes of the new storm before it. Time was running short. They moved as quickly as safety allowed through the increasingly challenging conditions. After several tense minutes, Sarah spotted movement ahead, a figure leaning heavily on a makeshift walking stick, and beside him, a large gray and white dog. "Mark Jenkins?" Sarah called as they approached. The man looked up, relief washing over his exhausted face. "Yes," he confirmed, "and this is Luna. She found me." Sarah stared in disbelief at the Malamute standing protectively beside the injured hiker. It was indeed Luna, the Hendersons' missing dog, thinner than in the photos they'd shared, but unmistakably the same animal. Somehow this lost pet had not only survived 4 days in wilderness conditions, but had apparently found and helped the missing hiker. "We need to get you both out of here," Sarah said, recovering from her surprise. "Another storm's coming in fast." The medical specialist on their team immediately began assessing Mark's condition while Sarah radioed the other search groups. "This is Connolly. We've located Jenkins. He's mobile but injured, sprained ankle, and mild hypothermia. We're also bringing in the Henderson dog, Luna. She's with him." She paused, still processing the unlikelihood of the situation. "Apparently she found him and helped keep him alive overnight." Mark nodded emphatically as the medic wrapped his ankle more securely. "I wouldn't have made it without her," he confirmed. "She brought me firewood, shared body heat, then led me toward where you would find us." Sarah knelt to examine Luna more closely. The dog was remarkably well-conditioned considering her ordeal, testament to the breed's resilience in harsh conditions. Luna allowed the examination, but remained attentive to Mark, clearly protective of her new human companion. "The Hendersons will be overjoyed," Sarah told Mark, "especially Emma, their daughter. She never gave up hope that Luna was alive." "She's incredible," Mark said, reaching down to stroke Luna's thick fur. "It's like she knew exactly what to do, exactly when I needed help most." The medic finished his initial treatment, securing Mark's ankle and providing him with proper cold weather gear from their supplies. "He can walk with assistance," he reported to Sarah, "but we need to move now if we're going to beat the worst of this storm." Sarah nodded, eyeing the rapidly darkening sky. "Nearest extraction point is the east trailhead. Can you make it that?" "Far?" she asked Mark. "With Luna's help I can," he replied without hesitation. Sarah watched as the Malamute immediately positioned herself at Mark's injured side, clearly understanding her role in supporting him. The dog's behavior went beyond well-trained. It seemed almost prescient, an uncanny awareness of exactly what was needed. "Let's move," Sarah ordered, her tone professional despite her amazement at the situation. "Storm's coming in faster than predicted." As they began their careful descent, Sarah found herself glancing repeatedly at the unlikely pair, the injured photographer and the lost Malamute, who had somehow found each other in the vast wilderness. In 15 years of search and rescue, she had never witnessed anything quite like it. The first heavy snowflakes were beginning to fall as they made their way down the mountain, a race against nature's timetable. But unlike yesterday when Marky had faced the storm alone, today he moved with purpose and support, both human and canine, his survival no longer in doubt. The descent was arduous, with Mark struggling to navigate the steep terrain despite support from both the rescue team and Luna. The Malamute seemed to intuitively understand his limitations, adjusting her pace to match his and providing a steady presence he could lean against when needed. As they slowly made their way down the mountain, the storm intensified around them, visibility diminishing with each passing minute. "We need to take a break," Sarah announced, noticing Mark's increasingly labored breathing. 5 minutes to rest and hydrate." The team found shelter beneath a cluster of dense pines where the snowfall was less intense. Mark sank gratefully onto a fallen log, stretching his injured leg before him. Luna immediately settled at his feet, her blue eyes watchful and alert despite her own evident fatigue. "How are you holding up?" Sarah asked, offering him a thermal container of hot tea from her pack. "Better than I was 12 hours ago," Mark replied with a weak smile. "When you're certain you're going to die alone in a blizzard, everything after." "That feels like a bonus," Sarah nodded, understanding the particular clarity that came with survival after a near-fatal experience. "You were lucky Luna found you." Mark looked down at the Malamute. "Luck doesn't begin to cover it. Finding exactly the right dog, one bred for Arctic conditions, precisely when I needed help most? The odds against that must be astronomical." Luna pressed closer to his leg, seemingly aware she was the topic of conversation. Mark automatically reached down to stroke her thick fur, a gesture that already seemed natural despite their brief acquaintance. "She's special," Sarah agreed. "The Hendersons have been frantic since she disappeared, especially Emma, their daughter. She kept insisting Luna was still alive out here." "Smart kid," Mark said, "smarter than most adults would be in that situation." As The rest of the team checked equipment and communications. Mark continued petting Luna, his expression thoughtful. "You know what's strange?" he said quietly. "I've spent the past day talking to her more honestly than I've talked to another human in years." Sarah raised an eyebrow, inviting him to continue. "Something about facing death, I guess. Or maybe it's easier confessing things to someone who can't judge you." He smiled ruefully. "I told her all about my failed marriage, my career disappointments, how I'd been using photography to keep the world at a safe distance rather than really engaging with it." "And how did she respond to these confessions?" Sarah asked, humor warming her professional tone. "Better than my ex-wife would have," Mark laughed softly. "She just listened. Sometimes that's all you need, someone to witness your truth without trying to fix it or judge it." Luna's ears perked up at his laugh, her tail sweeping a small arc through the snow. The connection between them was evident, something that transcended the normal bond between human and animal. In the midst of crisis, they had formed a partnership based on mutual need that had somehow deepened into something more profound. "We found something else while tracking you," Sarah said, reaching into her pocket. She pulled out a small Ziploc bag containing the broken piece of collar and blue paw print tag Mark had discovered earlier. "Emma made this tag for Luna. She'll be thrilled to know you found it." Mark nodded. "That's how I learned her name. She responded immediately when I said it." After their brief rest, the team resumed their journey downward. The storm continued to intensify, wind driving snow horizontally at times, forcing them to move in a tight formation to maintain visual contact. Mark's injured ankle throbbed mercilessly, but he pushed through the pain, acutely aware that stopping wasn't an option in these conditions. About an hour into their descent, Mark began to feel lightheaded, the combination of pain, exhaustion, and lingering hypothermia taking its toll. He stumbled, nearly falling, before Sarah caught his arm. "I need to check your temperature," she said, concern evident in her voice. The medic confirmed what Sarah suspected. Mark's temperature was dropping again, and the color draining from his face suggested the early stages of shock. They quickly set up a temporary shelter using an emergency tarp, where the medic administered warm fluids and additional heat packs. "His body's struggling to maintain temperature," the medic explained quietly to Sarah. "The combination of injury, exposure, and exertion is overwhelming his system." Luna, sensing the increased concern, pushed her way into the shelter and pressed herself firmly against Mark's side, her body radiating substantial heat. The gesture was so deliberate it startled the medic. "She did this last night, too," Mark murmured, his voice slightly slurred. "Don't kept me warm enough to survive." Sarah exchanged glances with the medic. "Let her stay," she decided. "She knows what he needs." As they waited for the warm fluids to take effect, Mark drifted in and out of awareness. In his semi-conscious state, he found himself talking to Luna again, though he wasn't entirely sure if he was speaking aloud or just thinking the words. "You know what I realized last night?" he murmured. "All those perfect photographs, technically flawless, none of them captured what I'm feeling right now. Connection, presence, being fully in this moment, even if it's a difficult one." Luna's blue eyes watched him steadily, her warm weight against him an anchor to consciousness. "The magazine editors was right," Mark continued. "My work shows what I see, not what I feel, because I wasn't feeling much of anything, just going through the motions, collecting images without being changed by them." In his feverish state, Luna seemed to transform. Slightly, her eyes more knowing, her presence more deliberate than any animal's should be. Was she merely a lost pet who'd stumbled upon him by chance, or something else entirely, a guardian spirit in canine form who had appeared precisely when needed? "Who are you, really?" he whispered, the question seeming perfectly reasonable in his altered state. Luna simply rested her head on his chest, her steady heartbeat a counterpoint to his own irregular one. The medic returned to check Mark's vitals, nodding with cautious approval. "His temperature's coming up. We should be able to continue soon if the storm doesn't worsen." But even as he spoke, the wind outside their shelter intensified, snow accumulating rapidly around the edges of the tarp. Sarah stepped outside briefly to assess conditions, returning with frost clinging to her eyelashes and concern etched on her face. "Visibility's down to 20 feet and dropping," she reported. "We're going to have to consider hunkering down until this passes." The implications were serious. They had emergency supplies for an overnight stay if absolutely necessary, but extending their time on the mountain increased risks for everyone, especially Mark, whose condition remained precarious. As the team discussed options, Mark felt himself slipping deeper into a feverish haze. The voices around him seemed distant and distorted, while Luna's presence became increasingly vivid. In his altered perception, her fur appeared to glow slightly, her eyes containing a wisdom impossible for an ordinary animal. "Stay with me," he thought, or perhaps whispered to her. "I still need you," Luna responded by pressing even closer, her warmth seeping into his chilled body. As Mark drifted toward unconsciousness, his last coherent thought was that, whatever happened next, he was no longer alone in the wilderness. He had been found, not just by the rescue team, but by something more profound and mysterious, embodied in the form of the extraordinary creature at his side. Sarah studied the weather data on her satellite phone with growing concern. The storm was intensifying beyond forecasts, with temperatures plummeting and snowfall rates approaching whiteout conditions. Their temporary shelter beneath the emergency tarp wouldn't suffice for an extended period, especially with Mark's condition deteriorating. "We need a more substantial solution," she told Mike, keeping her voice low to avoid alarming the others. "Jenkins won't survive a night out here in his current state," Mike nodded grimly. "There's an old Forest Service cabin about 2 miles southeast. It's basic, but it has a wood stove and 4 walls. Can we reach it in these conditions?" "It's our best option," Mike replied. "Alternative is trying for the trailhead, but that's twice the distance with more exposed terrain." Sarah made her decision. "We'll head for the cabin, prepare everyone to move in 5 minutes." While the team packed up their temporary shelter, Sarah checked on Mark. His color was slightly better after the warm fluids and rest, but his eyes remained unfocused, fever evident in his flushed cheeks. Luna hadn't moved from his side, her body pressed protectively against him. "Mark, we're moving to a cabin nearby," Sarah explained, unsure how much he comprehended. "It's going to be difficult, but we need to get you somewhere warmer." He nodded weakly. "I can make it." "Luna will help you," Sarah added, addressing the dog directly. Luna's ears perked up at her name, her intelligent eyes seeming to understand the situation perfectly. With Mark supported between 2 team members and Luna staying close to his injured side, they set out into the storm. Visibility had decreased to less than 15 feet, forcing them to navigate primarily by GPS. The wind cut through their layers despite high-quality gear, driving crystalline snow that stung exposed skin like tiny needles. Progress was agonizingly slow. What would normally be a 40-minute hike stretched into 2 hours of grueling effort. Mark drifted in and out of awareness, his weight increasingly supported by his rescuers as his strength failed. Only Luna's constant presence seemed to rouse him when he began to fade. "Just a little further," Sarah encouraged as they finally approached the cabin coordinates. "Stay with us, Mark." Through the curtain of snow, a dark shape gradually materialized, the outline of the Forest Service cabin, small but solid against the white backdrop. Sarah felt relief flood through her at the sight, though she maintained her professional composure. They weren't safe yet. The cabin was basic but sound, a single room with a wood stove, rough wooden bunks, and a small table. Years of Forest Service maintenance had kept it functional, if not comfortable. Most importantly, it was dry and sheltered from the howling wind. Mike and Dave immediately began working on the wood stove, using their emergency fire-starting supplies to ignite the agedum, but dry wood stacked beside it. Sarah and the medic focused on getting Mark stabilized helping him onto one of the bunks and replacing his damp outer layers with dry emergency clothing. Throughout the transition, Luna remained vigilant, watching each person who approached Mark with careful assessment. Only when he was settled on the bunk did she finally relax slightly, jumping up beside him despite Sarah's initial protest. "Let her stay," Mark murmured, the first coherent words he'd spoken in over an hour. "She's earned it." As warmth gradually filled the cabin, Sarah used the satellite phone to update base operations. "We've reached the old Forest Service cabin with Jenkins. He's stable, but requires medical attention as soon as possible. Storm conditions preventing immediate evacuation. Requesting helicopter standby for first weather window." The response was immediate. "Understood. County medical team standing by. Henderson family has arrived at base asking about their dog. Can you confirm status?" Sarah glanced at Luna, who had curled protectively around Mark on the narrow bunk. "Confirm Luna is with us. Healthy condition despite 4 days in wilderness. She appears to have been instrumental in Jenkins's survival." There was a pause before the response came. "Henderson's requesting to join standby team for extraction when weather permits. 10-year-old daughter quite insistent." Sarah smiled, despite the seriousness of their situation. "Understood. Advise them we'll bring Luna down as soon as conditions allow." After ending the communication, Sarah joined the team for a status assessment. The cabin would provide adequate shelter, and they had sufficient emergency supplies for at least 24 hours. The primary concern remained Mark's condition. His fever was persistent, and the medic was monitoring for signs of infection in his injured ankle. "Best case scenario, weather clears enough for helicopter extraction by morning," Sarah summarized. "Worst case, we wait out the storm here and assist Jenkins in walking out once he's stabilized." As evening approached, the team established a watch rotation. Mark had fallen into a fitful sleep, with Luna still curled against him, her head resting protectively over his chest. The sight was remarkably touching, this lost animal who had somehow found purpose in protecting a stranger. During her watch shift, Sarah sat at the small table, studying maps by headlamp and occasionally checking on Mark. During one such check, she found him awake, his eyes clearer than before. "How are you feeling?" she asked quietly, mindful of the others sleeping nearby. "Like I fell down a mountain," he replied with a weak smile. "But better than before." Sarah nodded, checking his temperature with a digital thermometer. "Your fever's coming down, that's good." Mark glanced at Luna, who remained pressed against his side, though now awake and alert. "Have you contacted her owners?" "The Hendersons?" "Yes," Sarah confirmed. "They're waiting at base camp. Their daughter Emma is apparently quite determined to be there when Luna comes down the mountain." A complex emotion crossed Mark's face, relief mixed with something that looked surprisingly like loss. "She should be with her family," he said, gently stroking Luna's fur. "They must have been worried sick." "Emma never gave up hope," Sarah told him, "kept insisting Luna was smart enough to survive up here." "Smart doesn't begin to cover it," Mark said. "She's extraordinary." As if understanding the conversation, Luna shifted position to lick Mark's hand, once before settling back against him. The gesture seemed to contain both affection and reassurance. "How did you end up out here alone?" Sarah asked. "The weather warnings were pretty clear yesterday." Mark sighed. "Overconfidence. Thought I could get to Falcon Ridge and back before the storm hit. Wanted to capture the approaching front from the overlook. Dramatic clouds over snow-covered peaks would have made a perfect shot." He laughed softly, without humor, "Willing to risk my life for another technically perfect, emotionally empty photograph." "Seems like you've had time to think about your priorities," Sarah observed. "Nothing like believing you're about to die to clarify what matters," Mark agreed. "And nothing like being saved by a dog you've never met to make you question everything you thought you understood about connection." Outside, the wind howled against the cabin walls, the storm showing no signs of abating. Inside, the small group of humans and one remarkable dog waited out the night, a fragile pocket of warmth and safety in the vast, indifferent wilderness. Sarah checked her watch. Still 8 hours until dawn, when they might have their first opportunity for extraction. For now, all they could do was maintain the fire, monitor Mark's condition, and hope the storm's fury would exhaust itself by morning. As she added another log to the wood stove, Sarah found herself watching Luna, wondering at the sequence of events that had brought this particular dog to this particular man at precisely the moment when each needed the other most. In her years of wilderness work, Sarah had developed a healthy respect for coincidences that didn't quite feel like coincidences at all. Dawn arrived with tentative fingers of light, barely penetrating the cabin's frosted windows. The storm had weakened overnight, but not disappeared entirely. Occasional gusts still driving snow against the walls with sudden fury. Mark's condition had stabilized somewhat, his fever reduced though still present, his breathing more regular as he slept. Luna had maintained her vigilant position throughout the night, moving only briefly when necessary, always returning to press her warm body against Mark's side. Now, as morning light crept into the cabin, she raised her head alertly, ears perked toward the window, as if sensing something beyond human perception. Sarah, who had taken the final watch shift, noticed the dog's changed posture. "What is it, girl?" she asked softly, moving to check outside. Through swirling snow, the sky showed patches of clearing blue, the first break in the weather since their arrival at the cabin. Sarah immediately reached for the satellite phone, contacting base. "Operations, weather window potentially opening at our location," she reported. "Visibility improving, requesting aerial assessment for possible extraction." The response was cautiously optimistic. The helicopter team was preparing, ready to launch as soon as conditions permitted safe flight into the mountains. The Hendersons had remained at base camp overnight, unwilling to leave until Luna was safely retrieved. As Sarah relayed the update to her now waking team, Mark stirred on the bunk, Luna immediately attentive to his movements. He looked markedly better than the previous evening, though still far from healthy. "Morning," he greeted Sarah hoarsely. "Any news?" "Storm's breaking up. Helicopter might be able to reach us soon if the clearing holds." Mark nodded, then winced. As he attempted to shift position, his injured ankle remained swollen and painful, despite the medic's attention. More concerning was the persistent fever and increasing tenderness around the injury, potential signs of infection setting in. "How long before they can get here?" he asked. "Depends on conditions at higher elevations," Sarah explained. "Maybe an hour if we're lucky, longer if the wind doesn't cooperate." Mark reached out to stroke Luna's fur, a gesture that had become natural over their short time together. "Hear that, Luna? You'll be back with your family soon," the Malamute responded by pressing her head against his hand, blue eyes fixed on his face with what could only be described as concern. Throughout their ordeal, Luna had displayed behaviors that went beyond normal canine intelligence, seeming to understand situations and needs with almost human comprehension. As the team prepared for potential evacuation, gathering equipment, and securing the cabin, Mark's condition took a sudden downturn. A violent shivering spell overtook him, despite the cabin's warmth, his fever spiking again as infection fought against his weakened immune system. The medic administered the strongest antibiotics from their emergency kit, but the limited supplies weren't equivalent to what Mark would receive in a hospital. Everyone in the cabin understood the increasingly urgent need for evacuation. "His system's fighting hard," the medic told Sarah quietly, "but the infection's gaining ground. We need to get him to proper medical facilities soon." Luna seemed to sense the increased concern, her behavior becoming more agitated as Mark's condition worsened. She paced between the bunk and the door, whining softly, then returning to press against Mark as if trying to share her strength with him. Outside, the weather continued its tentative improvement. Patches of blue sky expanded, though swirling. Snow still occasionally reduced visibility. Sarah maintained regular contact with the helicopter team, who reported they were preparing for approach to the cabin coordinates as soon as conditions met minimum safety requirements. Mark drifted in, and out of consciousness, the fever drawing him into a state where reality and dreams blurred together. In his lucid moments, he was aware of Luna's constant presence, her warmth against him, seemingly the only stable element in his fluctuating condition. During one such moment of clarity, he found himself alone with Luna while the team prepared. The exterior landing area, clearing snow to mark the site for the approaching helicopter. "You need to go home," he told the Malamute weakly. "Your family's waiting, especially Emma. She never gave up on you," Luna whined softly, pressing her head against his chest. "I'll be okay," Mark continued, trying to convince himself as much as the dog. "You've done more than enough, more than should be possible, really." In his feverish state, Mark found himself wondering again about the extraordinary sequence of events that had brought this particular dog to him at his moment of greatest need. Was it mere coincidence that of all the animals in these vast mountains, he had been found by one perfectly adapted to survive the conditions and seemingly programmed to provide exactly the assistance he required? "Who are you really?" he whispered, the question emerging from his fever-addled mind. Luna simply watched him with those intelligent blue eyes that seemed to contain wisdom beyond her species. The distant sound of helicopter rotors suddenly became audible, growing steadily louder as the aircraft approached their location. Luna's ears perked up at the sound, her posture becoming alert and tense. Sarah burst through the door, her expression relieved. "Helicopter's 5 minutes out. We need to prepare Mark for transport." As the team mobilized around him, Mark maintained his focus on Luna. "You're going home," he told her again. "Back to Emma and your family." Something in Luna's demeanor changed at that moment, a shift in posture, a new alertness. She moved suddenly to the door, pacing anxiously before returning to Mark's side, then repeating the behavior. "What's wrong with her?" the medic asked as they prepared to move Mark. "She senses something," Sarah replied, her experience with search dogs informing her assessment. "Might be the helicopter noise disturbing her." But Mark, despite his weakened state, recognized something else in Luna's behavior, a decision being made, a choice between conflicting imperatives. The dog seemed torn between staying with Mark and responding to some other urgent call. "Go," he told her softly. "It's okay. Go if you need to." Luna hesitated, looking between Mark and the door with evident distress. Then, with what seemed like reluctance, she moved to the door, pawing at it until Sarah opened it slightly. "Should we let her out?" Sarah asked uncertainly. "The Hendersons are waiting at base camp." "She knows what she's doing," Mark replied, though the words cost him effort. "She always has." Sarah opened the door wider, and Luna slipped through, pausing once to look back at Mark before disappearing into the snowy landscape outside. "Luna," Sarah called after her, concerned, but the Malamute was already moving with purpose, following some imperative only she understood. The sound of the helicopter grew louder, drowning out all other noise as it approached the clearing the team had. "Prepared?" Mark closed his eyes briefly, fighting a wave of both physical pain and emotional loss. Luna had been his guardian through this ordeal, and despite knowing she needed to return to her family, her sudden departure left a void that transcended their brief acquaintance. "She'll find her way to the base camp," Sarah assured him, seeing his distress. "Malamutes have incredible navigation skills." Mark nodded, but couldn't shake the feeling that Luna had left for a different reason entirely, that somewhere in these mountains, something or someone else needed her unique assistance just as he had. As the team prepared to move him to the helicopter, Mark found himself hoping that whatever had called Luna away, she would ultimately find her way back to the family that loved her. She had saved his life. Now he had to trust she could save herself. Luna raced through the thinning snowfall, her powerful legs carrying her swiftly away from the cabin. She moved with singular purpose, following an invisible trail that only she could sense. Occasionally she paused, head lifted to test the wind, before adjusting her course and continuing with renewed determination. Back at the cabin, the helicopter touched down in the clearing, its rotors sending swirls of snow dancing across the landscape. The medical evacuation team emerged with a stretcher and advanced equipment, quickly conferring with Sarah and the search team about Mark's condition. Infected wound, persistent fever, periods of disorientation, the medic reported crisply. We've administered available antibiotics, but he needs intravenous treatment and proper wound care. The evacuation medics worked efficiently, transferring Mark to their stretcher and attaching monitoring equipment. He remained conscious, but weakened, his gaze repeatedly drifting toward the open door as if expecting Luna's return. "The dog," he said to Sarah as they prepared to move him to the helicopter. "If she comes back, we'll make sure she gets to the Hendersons," Sarah assured him. "Try not to worry." Yet, as they carried him toward the waiting helicopter, Mark couldn't shake the sense of incompletion, as if Luna's sudden departure had left something important unresolved between them. It seemed impossible that an animal he'd known for less than 2 days could have formed such a significant place in his consciousness, yet the bond was undeniable. Halfway to the helicopter, Mark suddenly called for them to stop. "Wait," he insisted with unexpected strength. "Listen." The team paused, confused. At first, there was only the mechanical thrum of the helicopter's idling engines. Then, cutting through that steady rhythm came another sound, a dog's bark, followed by a distinctive howl that carried clearly across the snow-covered landscape. Luna, Mark identified immediately, struggling to rise from the stretcher. "That's Luna." Sarah held up a hand, signaling the team to wait, as she peered into the trees at the edge of the clearing. "There's something moving out there," she reported, reaching for her binoculars. Through the powerful lenses, she could make out Luna's distinctive form racing toward them. But the Malamute wasn't alone. Behind her, struggling through deep snow, was a human figure, small and clearly exhausted, but moving with desperate determination. "There's someone with her," Sarah announced, already signaling to the helicopter crew for additional assistance. "Looks like a child." The evacuation team immediately dispatched 2 members with emergency gear, following Sarah's direction toward the approaching figures. Mark insisted on remaining outside the helicopter despite his condition, his eyes fixed on the tree line where Luna had appeared. The Malamute burst into the clearing at full speed, immediately racing to the rescue team. Rather than greeting Mark as expected, she barked urgently, then turned to run back several yards before stopping to ensure they were following. "She's leading them to someone," Mark explained weakly, "just like she did with me." Within minutes, the rescue team returned carrying a small hypothermic figure wrapped in emergency blankets, a child, perhaps 9 or 10 years old, with a climbing helmet still strapped to her head. Luna trotted alongside, refusing to leave the child's side even as medics began assessment and treatment. "She's alive," the lead medic confirmed. "Core temperature dangerously low, but she's responding to stimuli. Looks like she was on a family climbing trip and got separated in the storm." As they brought the child to the helicopter, Mark recognized the distinctive helmet with colorful stickers. It had been featured in a recent article about a rising young climbing prodigy, Mia Rodriguez, who at 10 years old had already summited impressive peaks with her professional climber parents. "That's Mia Rodriguez," he identified, his photographer's memory for details serving him well even in his weakened state. "Her parents are Alex and Elena Rodriguez. They must be frantic." The information was immediately relayed to base operations, who confirmed that, indeed, a search was already underway for the Rodriguez child, separated from her parents during an ill-advised attempt to descend ahead of the storm. The family had been climbing in an area several miles from where Mark had been lost, making Luna's discovery of both stranded individuals across such distance even more remarkable. As both patients were secured in the helicopter, Luna finally approached Mark, pressing her nose gently against his hand in what felt unmistakably like reassurance. Despite his illness, Mark smiled. "You knew," he whispered to the dog. "Somehow, you knew she was out there, just like you found me." Luna's intelligent eyes held his gaze for a long moment before she turned back to the child, who, despite her hypothermic state, had reached out a small hand toward the Malamute. "Is this the dog that found me?" Mia asked through chattering teeth. "Her name is Luna," Mark told her, "and finding lost people seems to be her specialty." The flight medic interrupted, urgency in his voice. "We need to get airborne immediately. Both patients require urgent care, and another weather system is approaching." As they prepared for takeoff, a new problem emerged. Luna refused to board the helicopter, backing away from the open door despite coaxing from both Mark and the rescue team. "We can't force her," Sarah said after several attempts, "and we can't delay evacuation for either patient." Mark understood Luna's reluctance. Many dogs feared the noise and vibration of helicopters, and Luna had already demonstrated her independence throughout their ordeal. "The Hendersons," he remembered suddenly. "They're waiting at base camp. Can you bring Luna to them?" Sarah nodded. "We'll bring her down safely, I promise." It was the best they could do under the circumstances. As the helicopter lifted off, with both Mark and Mia secured inside, Mark watched through the window as Luna's form grew smaller below them, the Malamute standing beside Sarah in the clearing, watching their departure. The journey to the regional medical center took less than 30 minutes, a stark contrast to the arduous hours spent trying to descend the mountain on foot. Throughout the flight, medical staff worked intensively on both patients, with Mark's infection requiring immediate attention and Maya's hypothermia demanding careful rewarming protocols. As they approached the hospital helipad, Mark found his thoughts returning to Luna. In less than 48 hours, the remarkable dog had saved 2 lives in conditions that would challenge even experienced human rescuers. How had she known where to find each of them? What instinct or sense had guided her through blizzard conditions to locate humans in distress? The helicopter touched down on the hospital helipad, where medical teams waited with gurneys to transport the patients inside. As Mark was wheeled toward the emergency department, he caught sight of a small crowd gathered at the edge of the restricted area, among them a couple with a young girl who could only be the Hendersons, waiting anxiously for news of their dog. "Luna's coming down with the ground team," Mark called to them as he passed, summoning strength despite his condition. "She saved my life, and another child's too." Emma Henderson's face lit up at his words, her expression transforming from worry to joy. "I knew she would be helping someone," the girl called back. "That's what Luna does." The simple confidence in the child's declaration stayed with Mark as he was taken into the hospital. Perhaps Emma understood something about Luna that adults, with their need for logical explanations, had missed. Perhaps some connections defied conventional understanding, operating on levels beyond rational analysis. As the hospital doors closed behind him and medical professionals took charge of his care, Mark found himself smiling despite his pain and exhaustion. Whatever extraordinary circumstances had brought Luna to him in that desperate moment on the mountain, he was profoundly grateful, not just for his survival, but for the unexpected lesson in connection that had come with it. 3 days after his rescue, Mark Jenkins sat propped up in his hospital bed, his condition significantly improved, though still requiring medical supervision. The infection in his ankle had responded well to intravenous antibiotics, and his body temperature had finally stabilized at normal levels. Doctors expected a full recovery, though physical therapy would be necessary to restore full function to his injured ankle. He scrolled through messages on his newly charged phone, concerned texts from colleagues, a surprisingly warm email from his ex-wife Samantha, and numerous interview requests from media outlets fascinated by his survival story. The tale had captured public imagination. A photographer lost in a blizzard saved by a remarkable dog who then led rescuers to a second missing person before returning to her family. Local news had dubbed Luna the guardian Malamute of Glacier, featuring photos of the Hendersons reunited with their pet after Sarah's team had safely brought her down the mountain. Mark had watched the clip repeatedly. Emma Henderson's tearful embrace of the Malamute, Luna's evident joy at the reunion, John and Melissa Henderson's expressions of gratitude for everyone involved in bringing their dog home. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. Sarah Connolly stood in the doorway, still in her ranger uniform though off-duty. "Mind some company?" she asked. "Please," Mark welcomed her, setting aside his phone. "I've been hoping you'd stop by." Sarah settled into the visitor's chair, placing a small gift bag on the bedside table. "Brought you something. Figured you might need a distraction from hospital monotony." Inside the bag, Mark found a professional quality journal with a leather cover embossed with mountain peaks. "Thought you might want to document your experience," Sarah explained. "Sometimes writing helps process events like these." "Thank you," Mark said sincerely, appreciating the thoughtfulness of the gift. "How's everything at the park?" Returning to normal. "Storm damage cleanup mostly complete. Rodriguez family expressed their gratitude. They're convinced Mia wouldn't have survived another night out there." Sarah paused. "They want to meet you when you're feeling better. And the Hendersons too." Mark nodded, a mix of emotions crossing his face at the mention of Luna's family. "How is she?" "Luna? Thriving," Sarah assured him. "The Hendersons brought her by the ranger station yesterday. Apart from losing a few pounds during her adventure, she's completely healthy." Emma, barely, lets her out of sight. "Good," Mark said, though Sarah noticed a hint of something like loss in his expression. "That's good." They chatted about the rescue operation, filling in details Mark had missed during his fever-induced haze. Sarah described how Luna had led the ground team directly to Mia Rodriguez, who had become disoriented in the storm and taken shelter in a small rock overhang, nearly 2 miles from where Luna had found Mark. "The search dogs couldn't pick up Mia's scent due to the storm conditions," Sarah explained. "But somehow, Luna knew exactly where to go. The Rodriguez family had already been searching for 18 hours with no success. She's extraordinary," Mark said simply. "Speaking of extraordinary," Sarah replied, pulling out her phone, "have you seen the photos you took? Your camera survived in your backpack." Mark looked surprised. "I haven't had a chance to check them." Sarah handed him her phone, open to a news article featuring one of Mark's images, a snow-laden landscape captured just before the storm hit. Mountains partially obscured by approaching clouds, the foreground showing a lone figure trudging through deep snow. The composition was striking in its portrayal of human vulnerability against nature's power. "They're calling it your best work," Sarah told him. "That magazine that rejected your portfolio? They've contacted the hospital 3 times trying to reach you." Mark studied the image, seeing it with new eyes. Unlike his typically perfect, technically precise photographs, this one conveyed something different: emotion, vulnerability, the genuine experience of wilderness, rather than merely its surface beauty. "Maybe nearly dying gave me perspective," he mused. "Or maybe Luna did," Sarah suggested. Before Mark could respond, another knock came at the door. A nurse appeared, looking somewhat apologetic. "Mr. Jenkins? You have visitors. I told them only family during non-visiting hours, but..." She glanced over her shoulder. "They're quite insistent, especially the little girl." Mark sat up straighter, heart suddenly racing. "The Hendersons?" The nurse nodded. "And they brought their dog. Normally against hospital policy, but they have special permission from administration. Something about the dog being involved in your rescue?" "Please," Mark said immediately. "I'd like to see them." Moments later, the Hendersons entered. John and Melissa, with 10-year-old Emma leading Luna on a blue leash decorated with silver paw prints. The Malamute's reaction was immediate and unmistakable. She lurched forward, nearly pulling the leash. From Emma's grasp, her entire body quivering with excitement as she recognized Mark. "Luna, sit," John commanded, but the dog ignored him completely, straining toward the hospital bed. "It's okay," Mark assured them, extending his hand toward Luna. "Please." Emma released the leash, and Luna bounded to Mark's bedside, placing her front paws carefully on the edge of the mattress. Her tail wagged furiously as she pressed her nose against Mark's outstretched hand, then gently licked his fingers. "She remembers you?" Emma said with evident delight. "I told Mom and Dad she would. I remember her too," Mark replied, unable to keep emotion from his voice as he stroked Luna's thick fur. "Every minute." John Henderson stepped forward, hand extended. "We wanted to thank you in person. Ranger Connolly told us how you cared for Luna, how you recognized her tag." "Luna did the caring," Mark corrected, shaking John's hand. "I just had the good fortune to be found by her." Melissa joined her husband. "Emma insisted we visit as soon as we heard you were recovering. She has a theory about Luna finding you." Mark raised an eyebrow, looking at the young girl who now stood beside Luna, one arm draped affectionately over the dog's shoulders. "What's your theory, Emma?" "Luna's special," Emma stated with absolute conviction. "She always knows when someone needs help. Like when I fell off my bike last year and couldn't walk home, she found me even though she was supposed to stay in the yard. And when Dad's blood sugar got too low that time, she woke up Mom in the middle of the night. She's always been unusually perceptive," Melissa confirmed. "But what she did finding you and that little girl, it's beyond explanation," Mark nodded, understanding completely. "Some things defy logical explanation," he agreed, thinking of those moments in the wilderness when Luna had seemed almost mystical in her awareness and intelligence. Emma approached the bed, her expression earnest. "We brought something for you." She held out a framed photograph of Luna, the Malamute sitting regally against a backdrop of mountains. "So, you don't forget her." "I could never forget Luna," Mark assured her, accepting the gift with genuine appreciation. "Not in 100 years." As the conversation continued, Mark found himself studying this family unit, their evident love for each other and for their remarkable dog. Something about their connection resonated with him, highlighting what had been missing in his own life: genuine bonds that transcended surface interactions. Before the Hendersons departed, John handed Mark a card with their contact information. "Emma wanted me to invite you to visit once you're recovered. Luna would love to see you again. And I'd like to photograph her properly," Mark replied, "if that would be all right." "Of course," Melissa agreed warmly. Emma leaned in with a conspiratorial whisper. "Luna likes hiking best, especially in snow." As they prepared to leave, Luna seemed reluctant to depart, remaining pressed against Mark's bedside until called repeatedly by Emma. At the doorway, the Malamute paused, looking back at Mark with those intelligent blue eyes that had watched over him through the longest night of his life. "Thank you," Mark said simply, knowing the words were inadequate, but unable to express the depth of his gratitude in any other way. Luna's tail wagged once, a gesture that somehow conveyed perfect understanding before she turned to follow her family from the room. Sarah, who had remained quietly observant during the visit, spoke after the Hendersons had gone. "You know, the Park Service is looking for a new wildlife photographer for next season's promotional materials. Someone who understands the soul of this place, not just its surface beauty." Mark looked at her thoughtfully, something new stirring within him, a sense of possibility, of purpose rediscovered. "I might be interested," he admitted, "assuming my ankle cooperates." "Good," Sarah nodded, rising to leave, "because I already suggested you for the position, and I mentioned you might have a special assistant for some of the winter shoots." "Assistant?" Mark questioned. Sarah smiled. "A certain Malamute, who seems to have a talent for finding exactly what needs to be found in these mountains." After Sarah departed, Mark sat quietly, the framed photo of Luna beside him, on the bedside table. Outside his window, the mountains of Glacier National Park stood in silent majesty, no longer adversaries but companions in his unexpected journey toward rediscovering what truly mattered. In losing his way in the snow, Mark Jenkins had somehow found himself guided by a dog he had never met, who had appeared precisely when needed most. Second chances, he reflected, sometimes came in the most unexpected forms. His apparently had come with 4 paws, and knowing Blue,